We're back on our main story tonight, and Canadians are voting today with the race between Liberal leader Mark Carney and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre tightening. Federal election officials are counting ballots by hand, with in-person ballots counted at local polling stations. Mail ballots, along with those from special groups like military personnel and incarcerated voters, will be counted at Elections Canada offices. Tensions with the US are also in focus as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed President Trump's past comments about Canada potentially becoming the 51st state. Rubio claimed Trump's suggestion was a response to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's stance on trade. Meanwhile, both Carney and Poilievre have distanced themselves from the US, with Poilievre calling for Trump to stay out of Canada's election. Voters are focused on issues like the economy, housing and Canada's relationship with the United States. The biggest sweep of polls close at 9:30 Eastern Daylight Time, including in Ontario and Quebec. If the Conservatives or Liberals win big in the eastern part of the country, it is possible the election can be called earlier in the night. Well, before we jump into any discussion, let's take a quick look at the opinion polls, the final opinion polls, before people headed to the polls earlier on, with those open for around 12 hours. Let's have a look here very quickly for you. This is the Main Street Research, which released this poll on the 27th, the day before polling opened across Canada. The Liberal Party leading with 44%, but the Conservatives in this opinion poll just behind with 41%. The NDP and Bloc Québécois lower in single-digit percentages. We'll move on now, and it looks like there is a similar picture with the CBC poll tracker. It's important to note that the Conservative Party of Canada, while Justin Trudeau was still in power, at one point held a 25-point lead over the Liberals, but in recent weeks that has shifted according to the CBC poll tracker on April the 27th. The Liberals now have a 42.8%, with the Conservatives down at 39.2%. We'll show you just one more poll as we come to it here, the Abacus data poll. This is showing a slightly closer race between the Liberal Party of Canada and the Conservatives, and the NDP with a 10% vote share. The NDP previously being kingmaker with tight elections between the Liberals and the Conservatives. Could that be the case tonight? Well, joining us first to discuss this election night today is Terry Milewski, a former correspondent with CBC and author of Blood for Blood, who's joining us from Ottawa. Terry, thank you ever so much for being here with us. As the polls are open, people are voting. I want to first look at the candidates. We've seen already the major parties and the vote shares in the final polls before voting open, but can you talk us through the candidates and why people might be voting for them today?
Sorry, who's that question for?
Yes, for you, Terry.
I'm sorry. I've got too much to say, I guess, because this is an extraordinary election. As you pointed out already, it's extraordinary first because the Conservatives had this massive lead going into the campaign, and it's suddenly evaporated. Now they're struggling for air, and it looks like most of the pollsters think that the Liberals are going to win, and that they even may win a majority, which was completely out of the question a couple of months ago, when if you'd asked either of us this question, we would have said, the Liberals are toast, it's over, forget the election, they're history. And Justin Trudeau, of course, is history, but Mark Carney is very much not. And the explanation for all of this, of course, is President Donald Trump, the Conservative leader in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, picked the wrong brand to endorse, I would say. He, throughout the last couple of years, has been standing behind posters saying Canada first, obviously a direct steal from Donald Trump's America First, and going on about woke ideology, sounding the same MAGA themes. And it turns out that after he took power, that President Trump became the man to hate in Canada. Canadians were outraged, not concerned, not bothered, but outraged from coast to coast by Mr. Trump's attacks, not just on the Canadian economy, with the tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, potash, oil, you name it, but also on the very existence of Canada at all. That is, by threatening its existence and threatening to annex Canada and calling it, mocking the Canadian Prime Minister as the governor of the 51st state. And they're continuing that today. Mr. Trump is still at it today. So he's driving voters into the arms of the liberals. And so if there's an explanation, I offer you President Trump as the explanation. And I think that he is owed a message, a warm greeting card of thanks from the Liberal Party of Canada for his efforts on their behalf.
Absolutely, Terry. Of course, Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre expected to be the two frontrunners, but we also have the NDP, Bloc Québécois and the Green Party. What can you tell us about those parties and their leaders?
Well, they become irrelevant, don't they, in a tough two-party contest. The weak go to the wall. The also-rans are no longer relevant. They might have been relevant in a previous campaign when we were talking about, well, what about should we have government dental care plan, details of policy. But this election is not about details. It's not about how much did you hate Justin Trudeau. That's history, as I said. It's about how much do you hate Donald Trump. So these smaller parties become more or less irrelevant. Not that the Parti Québécois hasn't been basically irrelevant to most Canadians in any case, but they've got enough to win a bunch of seats in the Canadian Parliament. But the NDP has kind of blotted its copybook, if you like, by consistently saying, A, that they're going to support the Liberals and keep them in power by voting for them to sustain them in power because it didn't have a majority, and B, that the Liberals are terrible and they're bad for Canadians. Well, pick a lane. And so people are really confused. What really does the NDP stand for? And so they've slid badly in the polls. I really wonder if they'll get even 20 seats.
Terry, if you stay with us, I'm going to bring in Quinton A. Hitchcock, American political consultant, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Quinton, thank you very much for being here. From the American point of view, and with Donald Trump's statements that he's repeated again just ahead of the polls opening across Canada, what influence does Trump have in this election, and how might the influence of the result change the dynamic between Canada and America, who we know have historically been aligned, but following tariffs, everything has had a bit of a shake-up?
Well, I think the two countries are going to have a tricky path forward, but I think your previous guest said it perfectly. It's humorously mentioned in American politics, at least for the past 10 years, that there has been no greater turnout machine in the history of American politics than Donald J. Trump. And sure enough, that is turning out to be true now. We know that a record number of early votes had already been cast in Canada. 7.3 million Canadians have already casted their votes early. That means we're expecting anywhere from 12 to 13 million votes total, give or take. So that's going to mean that more people voted early in Canada than will vote on election day. That usually means one of two things. That means people are angry at their current government, or two, there's another source of urgency that they have to get to the polls and cast their ballot. But as it relates to Trump, he has a special talent of increasing turnout in elections. And we're learning that this is not just American elections now either. So it's going to be a complicated path forward, I think, depending on the two countries as it pertains to the trade talks and a lot of the turmoil that Canada and the US are now having. I think it's very, very likely that the Liberal Party continues to hold power and that Prime Minister Mark Carney continues to have power as well. So that being said, the path forward for the two countries is going to be awfully tricky, so we shall wait and see.
Absolutely. Terry, coming back to you, of course, this election, at least globally, has been dominated in world news with Donald Trump. But what are the key issues from within Canada that people are really talking about as they head to the polls?
Well, they're the same as they are throughout the Western democracies, aren't they? I mean, the Canadians are worried about the price of gas, about the price of groceries, the cost of living, the cost of housing in particular. And if you've seen, just by removing Justin Trudeau's carbon tax, as it was called, the price of gas has suddenly dropped because Mr. Carney has come into power as the leader of the Liberals and announced that he's going to kill the carbon tax, which Justin Trudeau swore by. So he's gone. Trudeau himself has gone. What are you aiming at? All the things you hated about the Liberal government have disappeared. Vote for me. So, and that appears to have been working so far. And I agree that the numbers that we've already seen for the early morning polls in the Eastern Canada and for the advanced polls elsewhere across the country, that these tell you that there is an anger and that there is an energy behind that anger that is driving people to the polls and to ignore the secondary issues. As I said earlier, I think that the policy, the day-to-day policy issues in Canada are not issues in this campaign except as secondary motivating factors. So if the reporter asks you, okay, give me another reason why you're supporting the Liberals this time, well, maybe they'll think of something else. But really, it's about sticking it to Donald Trump. That's what Canadians want to do, to be blunt about it. Canadians want to punch Donald Trump in the nose for his mockery of Canada's very existence and for the suggestion that Canada should become the 51st state, and for his abuse of Justin Trudeau in referring to him as the governor of that 51st state. These are absurd ravings, let it be said bluntly. I'm not saying that just because he's Canadian, it's just I don't know anyone who isn't a Canadian who thinks that this is actually a realistic scenario, that the United States could sweep into Canada as though it was Ukraine and have a war or something. I mean, it's absolutely nuts. So I'm not saying that the secondary issues like the cost of living are not issues in Canada. They will remain issues as between the voters and the federal government and as between the voters and all the provincial governments, for example, who run the healthcare system, which is in trouble and is underfunded. All of those things will come back to the fore after the election. But first, we want to get this message across. Trump, take a hike.
Absolutely. Andrew Latham is also joining us, Professor of International Relations at Macalester College and a Senior Fellow who is joining us from Ottawa, Canada. Andrew, thank you for being here. We've spoken about the impact of Donald Trump on this election, and we've shown data from opinion polls and that clear shift from the lead that the Conservatives had to now a clear Liberal lead in many polls. What part does the fact that Justin Trudeau stepped down and there is a new man at the helm of the Liberal Party have to play in these opinion poll data?
Well, that in conjunction with President Trump's insane claims about the 51st state, it made all the difference. Justin Trudeau was incredibly, after 10 years, incredibly unpopular. And Canadians, according to the polling data, were looking for any alternative, and Pierre Poilievre was the one that.
How can you see me?
Yeah, he's the one that bounced, right? But in the last week or 10 days, I
webcam, select the camera.
Apologies for the interruption there. We're having some technical busting on one end. Andrew, please continue.
So in the last week or 10 days, I think the debate in Canada has shifted. It's been less about Donald Trump and the 51st state and why in the world he would want. First of all, it wouldn't be the 51st state. It would be 10 provinces and 3 territories, and it would ensure a democratic majority in the Senate and forever and ever and ever. But that's not the point. The point is that in the last week or so, the final week of this election campaign, the debate in Canada has shifted, and it is more about domestic issues, cost of living. In Alberta, Danielle Smith talking about energy, and in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, talking about the cost of living and the inability of millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Zers and everybody else to buy a house. And then, of course, there's the Quebec dimension of this as well, which is really interesting to me because the discourse, the narrative there is very federalist all of a sudden, which you would think the Bloc Québécois wouldn't be advancing that particular narrative. So I think things have pivoted away from a focus on Trump and his madness.
Also joining us is Eric Wahlberg, a political analyst who is in Toronto. Eric, thank you very much for being here. Of course, the global issue of Trump's tariffs is something that has been hot on the Canadian agenda, the political leaders all talking about it. But it's not just the geopolitics of tariffs. There are also ongoing conflicts which Canada and its leaders have been involved with. We know, of course, Trudeau was involved in conversations around the Russia-Ukraine war, also tensions with China and words from Mark Carney on that matter. How important are these to Canadians as they're voting today?
Well, it should be very important, but in fact, both of the leading, the Conservative and the Liberal, they have virtually identical foreign policies. So they both are gung-ho on giving billions of dollars to Ukraine in a losing battle. So that's very foolish foreign policy on our part, I would say. And we're alienating the US, alienating Trump. And Carney also immediately said, we're going to do tit for tat. We're going to put tariffs onto. That is not the way you negotiate with Donald Trump. You don't. And then he rushed off to England to kiss the hand of the King Charles III. Well, this is a fairyland that he's living in. This banker, he's got no political acumen. And it's actually a disaster, this election, because we'll continue with supporting Israel. We'll continue supporting Ukraine. Both I see as international pariahs, and that we're only defeating ourselves. We have to make peace with Russia. Russia and Canada are the Arctic states. We should be working together. You don't make enemies out of a powerful neighbor that is just going to walk all over you. Basically, that's what we're doing with Trump. We're trying to stand up to a bully, and the bully will just walk all over us. And I don't see Putin as an enemy, really. He's not an enemy of Canada by any means. So by alienating him, we're alienating both global giants, which leaves us with China. And I suppose we're against China too, because we're following the US foreign policy, except on Ukraine. So really, it's a disaster, the Canadian elections. Whoever gets elected, Carney will be a bit better on the environment. That's the only real difference between the two. They'll both be standing up to Trump, trying to stand up to Trump, trying to stand up to Putin, and that's a failed enterprise. So we have very, very sad political situation in Canada right at the moment.
Quinton, I'm going to come to you next, and we've heard from all of our guests today about that strained relationship between the United States and Canada. From an American point of view, is there a potential for a strengthening of relations if the result goes one way or another in a few hours' time?
Well, I think we should pause and just remember, despite the president's rhetoric of running for a third term, there's really 3.5 more years of Donald Trump. That's the reality. Okay. So after that, the United States will have somebody else in the White House. So I do think in the long term, Canada and the United States are going to have a fantastic relationship and continue to work very collaboratively and have very strong economies helping and assisting one another. So that's the first observation I want to make. I think President Trump, like I said earlier, is having a tremendous influence on this race. Let's also remember that why do people vote? Okay, people are much more inclined to vote on impulse rather than vote on issues. And as somebody who has covered the president and worked in that ecosystem for a long time, I can tell you right now, nobody, and I mean nobody, can drive the impulses of voters quite like Donald Trump, especially a country like Canada, where the Liberal Party has been in power since 2015, and for many, many years, much of the country's existence prior to that. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic, but what we do know is that turnout is going to be at a record high. I do not think under any circumstance does that favor anybody other than the Liberal Party. So I think it should be a rather comfortable victory tonight. But the question then becomes, okay, what's going to happen after that? And President Trump, I think, is going to make every effort to have a collaborative relationship with Canada. I know the rhetoric may seem to tell a different story, but I do genuinely believe that the president is going to try to come to the table with Canada. The last thing I'll say, remember this is probably the most important point I can mention. A strong relationship with Canada is going to be imperative to President Trump's legacy. And again, there's nobody that cares more about their legacy and their public perception quite like Donald Trump. So I think he's going to come to his senses. This may have been just a tactic all along. That remains to be seen. But I do feel rather optimistic that the two countries are going to have a bright future together.
Andrew, I'd like to come to you. Quinton there talking about a potential comfortable win for the Liberals. Is that how you see it going?
I think it'll be close, but I think I agree with my colleague Quinton. I think that's the way it's going to shake out. I'm not sure that's the best outcome for Canada. I look at Prime Minister Carney as a green fanatic and as a technocrat of the worst sort. I don't think that he is going to be the best Prime Minister that Canada has ever had, but and there's some other things that are going on as well. The NDP is being wiped out. The Bloc Québécois is being marginalized as well. These are really tectonic plate-shifting development in Canadian politics. And I say that as somebody who, as a young man, always voted for the NDP. I just think that party is going away. And then we'll see. I agree. I think that, with Quinton again, I think that relations between the US and Canada will stabilize pretty quickly. There are just too many structural imperatives and incentives for the two countries to get along together, whether it's Arctic security or economic integration or whatever the case might be. They're just, it's inescapable. And so whatever turbulence President Trump is generating, I think will go away in the medium term, not the short term, but the medium term. And it'll be back to business as usual.
Terry, I'm going to come to you to bring a close to an end to this special programme hours away from a result. Looking at the polls, they have a general favourite, and that is the political newcomer, so to say, in Mark Carney, rather than the Conservative veteran, despite his age, in Pierre Poilievre. If the polls are to be believed, then it's only going one way. But what does Pierre Poilievre have to sort of hang his hopes on as Canada votes?
Well, I think there's very little because he's left it too late. He was slow on the uptake, I would say, with respect to the Trump challenge, whereas Carney was very quick to seize on this. He was going to be Captain Canada. He was the one who was going to stand up to Trump. That's exactly what Canadians wanted to hear. Whereas Poilievre, as I said earlier, had spent the previous 2 years aping Trump, making Trump-like noises across Canada, picking up policies and language from the far right in Canada. I'm not saying he personally is a far right, that he can probably properly be described that way, but he certainly played footsie with the far right in Canada, and he failed to switch when the world shifted underneath him, when Trump launched his tariff war and opened up an existential threat to Canada by threatening its very existence. I don't think that after those initial failures, political failures by the so-called experienced politician, Mr. Poilievre, I don't think that there was any comeback. I don't think there was any recovering from that, because Canadians decided very early on that Mark Carney demanding respect from President Trump, this was what they wanted to hear, and that won a lot of votes. Besides that, I think the pollsters, they're pretty confident about their predictions, and although that it may seem odd to outsiders that there's only a 3 or 5%, 3 or 5 point difference in favor of the Liberals right now in these polls. It seems pretty minor, not overwhelming, certainly not a landslide, but because of the vagaries of Canadian politics, it often does happen, doesn't it, that the Conservatives in Canada pile up huge majorities to win just a few seats, which they win by far more votes than they really needed to win that seat, whereas the Liberal voters tended to be more evenly diffused across the country, so they tend to win more seats with even the same or even less number of votes than the Conservatives. It's technical, but it's devastating when you actually come to count the votes and find out that even though you were pretty much even in the polls, you lost the election because the Liberals, their vote is more advantageously spread across the country. So was there a way out for Poilievre? I don't think there was. Not after the first couple of weeks of Carney's takeover of the Liberal Party and his initial reaction against Trump. I don't think there was any way for Poilievre to recover. And in fact, the polls suggest he hasn't.
Terry, Quinton, Eric and Andrew, thank you to all of you for joining us on this Canada election special. The 5-week campaign is over. Voting is here. Join us back on NewsX World in a few hours as we dissect the results and tell you who the next Prime Minister of Canada will be.